The palace slept under the silver light of the twin moons. High towers stretched into the sky like silent watchers, and the marble floors shone faintly under the glowing lanterns. It was quiet. So quiet that even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers who usually filled the halls were gone, posted at the far edges of the city walls. The council chambers were dark, the royal gardens were still, and every door was shut tight. In this sleeping world, only one sound broke the silence, a low, soft humming. A human voice. The janitor moved slowly down the long corridor, his boots tapping lightly against the floor. He wore a simple gray uniform, worn at the edges from years of work, and held a mop in his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. His hum wasn't loud. It drifted softly, like a small song that didn't need to prove itself. He didn't know if anyone heard it. He didn't care. It was his way of feeling less alone in a place where he didn't belong. On the top floor of the East Tower, the princess lay perfectly still in her silk bed, her head turned toward the open balcony. Her chamber was larger than most houses in the city. Golden silk drapes swayed gently in the night breeze, carrying the faint sound of the humming into her room. She wasn't asleep. She never slept when he was on night duty. She closed her eyes, pulled the covers slightly to her chin, and listened. The sound reached her like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. In the palace, she was surrounded by lies. Courtiers smiled because they had to. Soldiers bowed because they were ordered to. Even the stars that her people worshipped were wrapped in politics. Every sound in her world had a purpose, a strategy. Except this one. The soft humming of a human janitor, somewhere far below her chamber, was the only thing that felt real. He didn't know she listened. No one did. The royal family would never admit that the alien princess of the High Crown listened every night to the voice of a human, a servant from the losing side of a war. But she did. Every night without fail. She didn't even know why. Maybe because the palace walls felt less like a cage when his voice touched them. The janitor walked down the empty hall, the soft glow of the lanterns following him like quiet companions. He cleaned without hurry, humming a tune from Earth, one his mother had sung to him long ago. None of the aliens in this palace knew the song. It belonged to him alone. To the humans. He didn't know that every night, a pair of royal ears waited for that same song. The princess turned her head on the pillow. Her long silver hair spilled over the sheets like a soft river. She stared at the silk curtains covering the balcony doors. Beyond those curtains, the night sky stretched endless and cold, but the sound that drifted through made it feel warm. She let out a quiet breath, as if afraid to disturb the music. She remembered the first time she heard it. It had been months ago, on a night when her mind was too loud to rest. She had walked to the balcony to clear her thoughts. That was when she heard the low hum from below. At first, she thought it was a machine or some kind of venting system. But then she realized it had rhythm. Heart. A sound not made by a machine but by someone alive. She had followed the sound down the halls until she saw him. A human janitor, head bowed, humming softly while mopping the floors of a world that didn't want him. She should have reported him. A princess listening to a human servant was not just strange. It was dangerous. But she didn't. She came back the next night. And the night after that. Until it became part of her. A secret routine only the moons above knew about. Down below, the janitor paused for a second to adjust the mop bucket. His humming faded, then returned again, slow and steady. He never sang words, only the tune. The language of song didn't need permission. In a place where every human was reminded to stay silent, this was the only thing he allowed himself to keep. Far above, in the quiet darkness of her room, her heart gave a small jump when the humming stopped. Her fingers clenched at the bedsheet, almost without thinking. For a single breath, the silence returned to its cold, empty self. But then the sound came back, soft, gentle, like the night itself was breathing again. She relaxed. She told herself it didn't matter, that it was just noise. But she knew she was lying to herself. She had grown up in a palace built on rules. She was taught to keep her head high, speak only with purpose, trust no one. But this sound slipped through the cracks of those walls like moonlight through an open window. It didn't ask her to be a princess. It didn't expect her to be anyone at all. It just was. The janitor moved from hallway to hallway, unaware that his voice was wrapping around the highest chamber like a soft blanket. He didn't look up. He didn't imagine a princess lying awake listening to him. For him, it was just another long night in a place where he didn't belong. He hummed because it kept the silence from swallowing him. And she listened because it made her feel less alone. The palace clock ticked softly in the distance. The moons cast their light through the curtains, touching the corners of the princess's bed. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she refused to sleep. Not yet. She wanted to hear it a little longer. The sound that didn't ask for anything. The sound that didn't lie. Down below, he kept humming. And up in her golden cage, she pretended to sleep. For everyone else in the palace, this was just another quiet night. For him, it was another shift he didn't care about. But for her, it was everything. A piece of something real in a world that had forgotten what real meant. And as the wind moved through the open windows, carrying that sound deeper into the night, she knew that she would wait for it again tomorrow. And the night after that. Because in a palace of power and silence, the soft hum of a human was the only thing that made her feel alive. The moonlight spilled softly over the tall towers of the alien palace, and the night carried its usual silence. But inside the princess's chamber, the silence was a trap she knew well. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that pressed against her ribs and made it hard to breathe. She lay still under her silver sheets, eyes closed but mind wide awake, waiting for the one sound that could calm the storm inside her head. Then, like every night, it came, a low, gentle humming drifting up through the long halls below. The sound was soft and warm, as if it belonged to a different world. Down below, the human janitor worked alone. His shift always started when the palace slept. He mopped the endless marble floors, cleaned the lantern glass, wiped away the shine that no one else noticed, and hummed the same tune his mother used to sing when the world still felt safe. It was the only thing that kept him from feeling invisible. He didn't know the princess listened. He didn't know that, in a palace built on cold power and hard rules, his voice was the only thing that sounded alive. The princess opened her eyes slowly, staring at the curtain moving in the night breeze. The humming wrapped itself around the corners of her room like a thread pulling her out of her own loneliness. For years, she had grown up surrounded by advisors, soldiers, and courtiers. They spoke to her with polished smiles, measured words, and practiced loyalty. But none of them ever sounded like this. This sound was soft, unguarded, real. She rose quietly from her bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor without a sound. The palace guards would have scolded her for moving around at night, but she didn't care. She crossed the room slowly, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the glowing hall below. There he was. A human. A simple janitor. Bending slightly as he pushed his mop across the floor. His hair was messy, his uniform faded, but he moved with a quiet rhythm. His lips curved slightly, not a smile, but the kind of expression people make when they forget the world is watching. She didn't know his name. No one cared to know the name of a human servant here. And yet, for her, he had become a part of the night. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cold glass of the window. Every part of her life had been planned, arranged, controlled. Her future wasn't hers. Her words belonged to the council. Even her silence was political. But this sound, this small, fragile humming, belonged to no one but him. It had no agenda, no weapon, no crown. It just was. She remembered the first night she heard it. She had been younger, restless, and furious at the world. The council had forced her to sit through another meeting about the human colonies, speaking about them like problems to be solved. She had stormed back to her room and thrown open the windows just to breathe. That was when she heard it, this quiet, imperfect song echoing up from the empty corridors. That night, she didn't feel like a princess. She felt like a girl again, listening to something small and good in a world that didn't have much of either. Below, the janitor kept working. He didn't know anyone was watching. Humans in this palace weren't supposed to be noticed. They were meant to blend into the walls, silent, obedient, forgettable. He hummed because it made the silence less cruel. In the dark corners of his mind, he sometimes imagined he was far away from here, back home where stars looked different and people weren't treated like shadows. The princess leaned forward slightly. She didn't know why it mattered so much. She didn't even fully understand why she came to the window every night. She could order him replaced. She could make him disappear from the palace with one word. But the truth was, she didn't want to. A soft creak echoed from the far end of the hallway. One of the patrolling guards appeared, boots clicking sharply against the floor. The janitor instantly lowered his voice, his humming almost fading to nothing. He kept his head down, body stiff, as the guard passed. She felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't fear for herself. It was for him. She didn't like the way he fell silent around others. It made the palace feel colder. Once the guard was gone, the humming returned. She let out a slow breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She sat down on the edge of the window, folding her legs against her chest like she used to when she was little and afraid of the dark. Except now, she wasn't afraid of the dark itself. She was afraid of what it held. The endless weight of expectations, the empty halls, the sound of people who spoke to her only because of what she was, not who she was. His voice cut through all of that like a single candle flame in a dark room. The janitor continued his work, never looking up. But his voice filled every corner of her room, wrapping around her like a soft blanket. She rested her chin on her knees, listening. She often imagined what it would be like if she could speak to him. Just once. Ask him why he hummed. Ask him what the song meant. But a princess couldn't speak to a janitor. Not here. Not in a palace where humans were barely treated as equals. If anyone found out she had even noticed him, it would become a scandal. So she did the only thing she could. She listened. The night stretched on, slow and gentle. The guards passed again. The palace breathed, and he hummed. She let her eyes close, not to sleep, but to hold onto the sound a little longer. Outside, the twin moons climbed higher. The palace, a monument to power and silence, didn't realize that its cold heart was being warmed by something as simple as a human janitor's song. He finished mopping the long corridor and moved farther down, his tune fading little by little. The princess leaned closer to the glass, straining to hear the last note. When it was finally gone, the silence returned, loud, sharp, and empty. She lay back on her bed, pulling the blanket over herself. Her eyes stared at the ceiling as the memory of the humming lingered in her chest like a small, fragile flame. Tomorrow night, she would be here again, pretending to sleep, listening to him. And for a few quiet minutes, the alien princess of a great empire would feel something she never felt anywhere else. Peace. The wind outside brushed against the tall palace towers like a quiet sigh. It was another night, another shift, and another song. The human janitor moved down the long hallway, mop in hand, humming softly to himself. He didn't need a rhythm. It lived in him. The halls were always silent at this hour. No court members, no servants, no guards except the patrol. Only him and the cold shine of the marble floor beneath his boots. He didn't know that far above him, in the silver chamber of the royal tower, someone was waiting. The princess lay on her side, half hidden under her silk sheets, pretending to sleep as she did every night. But unlike the other nights, something felt different. Her heart was beating too fast. Her fingers twisted lightly in the fabric of her blanket as she stared at the curtain near her balcony. She could hear the sound already, faint and distant, climbing the stairwells like warm smoke, his humming. It had become part of her. A secret heartbeat that kept her from being swallowed by the cold walls of her own world. Tonight, though, her thoughts wouldn't stay still. She remembered the whispers she'd overheard earlier in the day. The council had been meeting behind closed doors. They spoke of rising tensions, of removing unnecessary human presence from royal grounds. She had stood on the other side of the wall, listening quietly, pretending not to care. But she cared. And now, lying in the darkness, her chest ached with the thought that maybe this was one of the last nights she'd ever hear that voice again. Down below, the janitor hummed as always, not knowing the storm gathering above him. His voice carried through the pillars and the stairwells, warm and soft, steady as the moonlight. He had no idea that a princess, a being born into power, into everything he was not, was clinging to the sound of his song like a lifeline. The princess slid her legs off the bed and moved toward the balcony. She didn't light a lamp. She didn't need to. The pale glow from the moons filled her room with silver light. She moved like a ghost, silent, careful, and stopped at the edge of the balcony curtains. She parted them slowly, just enough to see. There he was again, at the far end of the hall, alone as always. His head was slightly bowed as he pushed the mop across the floor, the sound of water faintly echoing behind his quiet song. His uniform was faded at the sleeves, the boots too worn for palace standards. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a place of gold and marble. But somehow, the moment he started to hum, the palace itself seemed less cold. Her breath caught when she heard footsteps at the other end of the corridor. A guard. She knew what would happen. She'd seen it before, how the humans went silent the second someone in uniform appeared. And just as she expected, his humming stopped. Just like that, the warmth was gone. The guard passed by without looking at him, but the human kept his head low, hands tightening around the mop. She could almost feel the invisible weight pressing down on him, the kind that made people shrink into the background. She hated it. She didn't even know why, but the silence after his voice disappeared made something in her chest tighten. When the guard's footsteps faded, something small but brave happened. The janitor began to hum again. It was softer this time, almost like a secret whispered to himself. But it was there, still alive. Her throat tightened. She had grown up hearing people speak loudly, demand, command, lie. But this sound was not loud. It was quiet. And maybe that's why it mattered. She leaned closer to the window, her fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. The thought came suddenly, without warning. What if this is the last time? The council had the power to end his shift forever. They could remove him, transfer him, erase his presence from these halls like he had never existed. She didn't want that. Her heartbeat quickened, louder than she wanted. And then it happened. A small, accidental sound escaped her. A soft gasp she hadn't meant to make. Down below, the janitor stopped humming immediately. Her breath caught. For the first time in months, she had broken the silence between them. He looked up. Not all the way, just a slow, uncertain lift of his head toward the source of the sound. He couldn't see her clearly from this distance, hidden in the shadows of the balcony. But his body tensed slightly, as if realizing that someone had been there all along. The princess froze where she stood, every nerve in her body screaming at her to move, to hide, but she couldn't. She could only stand there, watching him from behind the curtain as his eyes scanned the hallway. A few seconds passed, but they felt endless. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of panicking or walking away, he did the simplest, quietest thing. He began to hum again. She didn't understand it. Anyone else would have stopped. Anyone else would have feared who might be listening. But he didn't. His voice returned, steady and soft, almost as if saying, "I don't mind." Her chest ached in a way she couldn't explain. Her hands trembled slightly against the curtain. No one had ever responded to her silence like that before. She slowly stepped back, letting the curtain fall in place. Her knees felt weak, as if something small but powerful had just shifted in the air between them. She climbed back onto her bed, her heart still hammering in her chest. Down below, he kept working, as if nothing had happened. But there was something different in the way the sound reached her now. It wasn't just background anymore. It wasn't just a song in the night. It was a choice. A quiet act of defiance against the cold silence of the palace. She lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since she was a child, the silence in her room didn't feel like a prison. It felt alive. Because someone down there had chosen to keep singing. She whispered into the darkness, so soft that even she could barely hear it. "Don't stop." The song below grew steady, like an answer. And as the night deepened, the distance between the alien princess in her tower and the human janitor below became a little smaller, wrapped together in a sound neither of them could explain. The palace stood beneath a sky that looked endless, cold, and pale. But inside, the night felt different. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was tense, alive, humming with something that neither of them, neither the princess in her silk-covered chamber nor the human janitor in the dark hallway, fully understood. He walked slowly, the mop gliding over the polished floor, humming the same soft tune he always did. But now, he was aware of something he had never thought about before. A sound. A gasp. Someone had been there last night. He had felt it. The way the silence shifted, the way the air carried the weight of a presence above him. For months, he had hummed alone. But last night, for the first time, he wasn't alone. The princess sat on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the curtain near her balcony. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. The sound of his voice last night had been different, sharper, closer. And when she'd made that small, accidental sound, he had heard her. She was sure of it. But instead of stopping and walking away, he had kept singing. That simple act had echoed in her chest long after his footsteps disappeared. She rose quietly and padded across the room, letting the moonlight guide her steps. The air carried the familiar scent of polished floors and night air. Her heart thudded softly. She reached the balcony again, slowly pulling the curtain aside. There he was. The same human janitor. The same faded uniform. The same rhythm in his steps. But something about the night felt heavier between them. He moved with the same quiet care, but every so often, he looked up, not directly at her, but toward the high shadows of the balcony, like someone who had felt eyes on him and didn't know what to make of it. Her breath caught as his humming began. It was steady, soft, just like always. But she heard it differently now. Before, it had been a secret sound she had stolen from the night. Now, it felt like something shared. She pressed her forehead gently against the cold glass, listening. She could almost feel the shape of the song wrapping around her. And beneath that warmth, a sharp fear twisted in her chest. She remembered what the council had said only 2 days ago. Talk of removing unnecessary humans from the palace. Talk of cleansing the royal grounds. Their words had been smooth and political, but she had felt the cruelty beneath them. If they took him away, the halls would go silent again. She would be left with nothing but the cold. The humming paused for just a second as he wrung out the mop, and even that tiny gap made her chest tighten. She wasn't supposed to care about a human janitor. She wasn't supposed to feel anything. But she did. Not in a way she could explain to anyone else. Not in a way she even fully understood herself. The janitor tilted his head slightly, his eyes flicking upward toward the balcony again. He didn't see her, but he felt her. It wasn't the kind of feeling you could explain with words, just a quiet certainty in the bones. For months he had thought his humming filled only the empty air, but now there was something in that air, listening back. He kept humming, softer than before, like a whisper meant for someone specific. The princess leaned a little closer to the window, holding her breath. Then, without planning it, she moved. She opened the balcony doors. The sound was soft, just a faint metallic click as the latch gave way. But to him, in the quiet hallway, it was as loud as thunder. His head jerked upward. She froze where she stood, her hand gripping the doorframe, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. This was not part of the game she had been playing with herself all these months. She was supposed to stay hidden. She was supposed to pretend. But something inside her wanted more than the sound through the glass. The janitor's humming faltered. His eyes flicked up toward the sound. He could see movement now, a faint shape behind the soft curtain of the balcony. His fingers tightened around the handle of the mop. If the wrong person saw him looking up, he could lose his job. Or worse. Humans weren't supposed to look toward the royal chambers. But then he heard something he never expected. Her voice. Soft, barely audible. Like the night itself whispering. "Keep singing," she said. He froze completely. For a long moment, he wasn't sure he had even heard it right. A princess didn't speak to someone like him. A princess didn't speak to anyone alone at night. But the sound of her voice was real. Soft. Fragile. Real. He didn't answer. He couldn't. But after a few seconds, his humming returned. A little louder this time. Not because he was confident, but because something inside him responded to the way her voice had sounded. Her heart jumped. The sound filled the night again, wrapping around the two of them like an invisible bridge. She leaned against the doorframe, letting the night air brush against her skin. For the first time, she wasn't just a hidden listener in the dark. She was part of it. Down below, he kept working, but his movements were slower now. Not because of fear, but because everything suddenly mattered in a way it hadn't before. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. He didn't know if this moment would ever return. But right now, she was listening. For a long while, neither of them spoke. He hummed, she listened, and the palace, the same cold, empty place that had been their prison in different ways, became something else. But outside the palace walls, the world was changing. The tension between her people and the humans had been rising for weeks. Armies were moving. Rumors of war spread like fire through the outer colonies. And though neither of them said it, they both felt the weight of something coming. Something that could tear this fragile, quiet bond apart before it even had a name. The last note of his song drifted upward and faded into the night air. She stood in the doorway, not hiding anymore, just breathing the same air as him. And down below, he tilted his head slightly, not to bow, not to speak, but just to acknowledge the silence they had built together. Then, slowly, carefully, he moved on to the next hallway. The sound of his boots faded into the distance. The princess closed the balcony doors but didn't move away. She stood there long after he was gone, staring into the empty hall. The night no longer felt cold. It felt dangerous, fragile, beautiful. And for the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't just listening to a voice. She was holding on to it. Because soon, the world outside their silent exchange would come knocking, and it would not be kind. The following night came heavy with rain. Dark clouds rolled in from the outer hills, and the usual silver light of the moons was gone. The palace stood under a restless sky, its tall towers almost swallowed by the storm. The sound of rain hitting the roof echoed through the empty corridors, mixing softly with the hum of the janitor's voice. But tonight, everything felt different. The air was not calm anymore. It was thick, restless, like the night itself was waiting for something to happen. The janitor moved down the hall with his usual mop, the bucket wheels creaking faintly behind him. But his humming wasn't the same. It was lower, slower, like he was carrying something inside that wouldn't let him breathe as easily as before. He'd been warned earlier that day. A short, sharp message from one of the alien supervisors. No smile, no emotion, just cold words. Your service in the palace is no longer required. You will be transferred at sunrise. He didn't ask why. He knew why. Humans didn't belong in places like this. They never did. He should have been numb to it. But for some reason, when he walked down that hall tonight, the thought of leaving this place felt like a heavy stone pressing against his chest. It wasn't the job. It was her. The princess sat on the floor of her balcony with her knees pulled tight to her chest, wrapped in a robe of soft white silk. She'd overheard the news. Council meetings didn't need to be loud for their decisions to find their way to her. They spoke of moving the human workers out, of replacing them with their own kind. Unnecessary presence, they called them. She hadn't said anything then. She couldn't. Princesses didn't speak in meetings. Princesses listened. Princesses obeyed. But tonight, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. She was waiting for his song. She was waiting for the sound that had become the one small thread that held her world together. The storm outside made everything harder to hear, but then she caught it, a faint hum rising up from the floor below. It wasn't as strong as before, but it was there. It was still him. She pushed open the balcony doors and stepped out into the rain. The drops fell softly against her hair, cool and sharp, but she didn't care. She just needed to hear it clearly. Down below, he paused when he saw the movement. Even through the storm, he could feel it, her presence. The last few nights had changed everything between them. It wasn't spoken, but it was real. She wasn't just a shadow behind the curtain anymore. She was there, listening. He closed his eyes for a brief moment and forced the humming to continue. It wasn't for himself anymore. It was for her. She leaned over the railing, the rain wetting the edge of her robe. She shouldn't have been out there. If anyone saw her, it would raise questions. A princess, standing in the rain, listening to a human janitor? It would be called scandal. Betrayal of the old ways. But none of that mattered right now. All she wanted was to hear his voice one more time. As he moved to the center of the hall, his voice grew stronger, not loud, but steady, like he wanted the walls themselves to remember it. She pressed a hand against her chest, trying to hold down the ache rising inside her. Tomorrow, he would be gone, and the palace would go back to its silence. The thought clawed at her. She imagined waking up to a night without his humming. A night where the rain fell and the halls stayed empty. It would be colder than any winter. She whispered without realizing it. "Don't go." The sound didn't reach him clearly through the rain, but something in her voice must have carried across the space because he paused. For a heartbeat, their eyes almost met through the storm. She froze, breath caught in her throat. But then something happened that no princess was supposed to witness. He set down the mop. Slowly, carefully, and he began to hum louder, letting the sound fill the corridor like a quiet promise. Her eyes burned with something she didn't understand. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was real. Real in a way that nothing else in her life had ever been. But the night didn't belong to them alone. A door slammed open at the far end of the hall. The sound cracked through the storm like a gunshot. 2 guards stepped in, their heavy boots splashing against the wet floor. Their sharp voices cut through the humming. "Human, step away from the royal wing." The janitor froze. He knew what came next. They'd been looking for a reason to throw him out sooner. And standing this close to the princess's chamber at night was all the excuse they needed. The princess's heart hammered painfully in her chest. She wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't supposed to interfere. But watching the guards approach him like he was dirt under their boots made something inside her snap. Before they could grab him, she stepped out from the shadows of the balcony and into the light. The guards stopped instantly, their eyes going wide. No one expected the princess to appear in the middle of the night, drenched from the rain, barefoot, standing above a human. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the storm like steel. "Leave him." The guards shifted uncomfortably, their hands still on their weapons. "Your Highness, it is not appropriate." "Did I stutter?" she asked, her tone sharper this time. For a second, all anyone could hear was the storm. The guards stepped back slowly, unsure of what to do. She never spoke like this. She was the quiet princess, the obedient heir. But not tonight. The janitor stared up at her, unsure if he should bow, speak, or simply disappear. He'd never been protected before. Not by anyone. And certainly not by someone like her. She held his gaze for a long moment, the rain still dripping from her hair, her breath steady. Then, as if nothing had happened, she whispered again, "Keep singing." The guards exchanged nervous looks but didn't dare to interrupt again. His throat was tight. He hadn't realized until this moment how much the act of humming meant to him. Not just because it kept him sane, but because someone had been listening. And now, even as everything around them trembled, she had spoken for him. So he hummed again. The storm raged. The guards stood still. And the princess, standing on her balcony, let the sound wash through her like a heartbeat. She knew tomorrow would not be kind. The council would demand answers. He might still be forced to leave. But this moment, right here, was real. And nothing, not power, not rules, not walls, could take it away from them. The night carried his voice through the rain like a small, stubborn light in the darkness. And the princess, for the first time in her life, no longer felt alone. The storm did not stop. It grew heavier, louder, as if the sky itself wanted to break open. The palace lights flickered in the wind, and the rain hit the towers like thousands of tiny drums. The human janitor stood in the hallway, soaked, breathing slowly, as the princess stared down at him from her balcony. Everything had changed in a single night. The sound that had been their quiet secret was no longer hidden. The guards had seen. And more would come. The princess was still barefoot, her hair wet, her robe clinging to her from the rain. But she didn't care. She had spoken for him. She had defied the guards in the open. And now she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear, yes, but something stronger than fear. Resolve. The guards shifted uneasily under her gaze. One of them finally gathered the courage to speak. Your Highness, the council will not approve of this. He shouldn't even be here this late. It's against the protocols of royal security. She didn't even blink. Her voice came out calm, almost too calm. He's done nothing wrong. The guard looked from her to the human, his jaw tight. He had been trained to obey the royal bloodline, but he also knew the council's rules. Standing between those two powers was like standing in the center of a storm with no cover. The human lowered his gaze to the floor, water dripping from his sleeves. He'd seen this kind of moment before. He knew how it ended. Humans didn't win. Not here. Not in this place. He had already made peace with leaving, with disappearing before the sunrise. What he didn't understand was why she, someone who lived at the top of everything, had chosen to speak for someone at the bottom. She stepped closer to the edge of the balcony. The storm winds pushed against her, but she didn't retreat. If you take him away, she said softly, you answer to me. The guards froze. No one in the lower ranks dared to challenge the princess directly. Her words carried weight. Even if she was young and quiet, she was the voice of the royal blood. And for a moment, the thunder outside was the only sound in the hall. The human looked up at her slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no title between them now. No curtain. No distance. Only two people caught in a moment neither of them had planned. Finally, the guards stepped back. As you command, one said stiffly. They turned away, their boots echoing down the corridor as they disappeared into the stormy night. The silence they left behind wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, real. She stayed on the balcony even after they were gone, rain still running down her face. He stood below, holding the mop loosely, unsure what to do. She should have gone back inside. He should have lowered his head and left. But neither of them moved. She spoke again, barely louder than the rain. They're removing you in the morning, aren't they? He didn't answer at first. But she didn't need him to. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped. Her fingers tightened against the balcony rail. I heard the council, she whispered. They called your kind unnecessary. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. He gave a small nod. It wasn't anger on his face. It wasn't even surprise. It was the quiet acceptance of someone who'd lived his whole life being moved around like a tool. She took a step back, but then stopped. She didn't want the night to end this way. She didn't want to pretend tomorrow would be just another day. It wouldn't. Why do you hum? She asked suddenly. Her voice cracked just slightly, not from weakness, but from something she couldn't quite name. He blinked at her through the rain. The question surprised him more than her defiance had. No one had ever asked him that. No one had ever cared. He tilted his head a little, water dripping from his hair, and after a long pause, he answered quietly, because it reminds me I'm still human. The words struck her like a wave. So simple. So raw. In this palace where every sound was carefully chosen, every word meant something political, his words carried no weight but truth. She didn't realize her hands were shaking. It's the only real sound in this palace, she whispered. For the first time, he let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. That's not saying much. The storm cracked loudly overhead, but neither of them flinched. You'll leave tomorrow, she said softly. And then it'll be silent again. He looked down, his jaw tightening. It was always supposed to be. She stared at him for a long moment, her heart twisting in a way she didn't understand. She was the princess of an empire. She had been raised to make hard choices, to be untouchable, unshakable. But standing there, hearing the rain between them, she felt smaller than she ever had before. And more alive. She stepped back into her chamber slowly, but she didn't close the doors. Then sing for me tonight, she said, her voice barely carrying over the storm. One last time. For a moment, he didn't move. But then he lifted his chin, closed his eyes, and began to hum. The sound was different this time. It wasn't quiet like before. It was steady, warm, alive, rising through the storm like light through smoke. It filled the corridor, the balcony, the night sky. It wasn't meant for the palace anymore. It wasn't meant for survival. It was for her. The princess leaned against the doorframe, closing her eyes. The sound wrapped around her like a memory she didn't want to lose. She didn't care who heard it now. The guards, the council, the entire empire, it didn't matter. For the first time in her life, she wasn't listening because she had to hide. She was listening because she chose to. He hummed through the rain until his throat burned and the storm began to ease. And when his voice finally faded into the night, the palace didn't feel empty anymore. It felt carved with something unforgettable. She opened her eyes slowly, the world blurring slightly through the rain and the weight of what tomorrow would bring. "I won't forget," she whispered. He looked up one last time. He didn't bow. He didn't speak. But the silence between them carried more than any words could. Tomorrow, the council would try to erase him. But they couldn't erase this night. They couldn't erase his song. And they couldn't erase the fact that the alien princess and the human janitor had shared something real in a place built on lies. As the storm finally softened into a quiet drizzle, the palace returned to stillness. But this time, the silence didn't win. His song still lingered in the air, a quiet echo of defiance and something more. Something dangerous. Something unforgettable. And in her heart, she knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of something the council would never understand.